So good afternoon. Welcome to our department's citywide psychiatry grand rounds. I am Shaheen Durrani, Director of Faculty Development for our Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Thank you for joining us today. Prior to the start of our session, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Before I read it, please take a moment to situate yourself and think about the land under and around you. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the sites of the Department of Psychiatry are located that precede the establishment of the University of Toronto. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Since this event is a virtual gathering, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations. There are few places on earth that someone before us has not called home. We are delighted today to have Dr. Paul Appelbaum, Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law, and Director, Center for Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry at Columbia University, present Department's Dr. Vivian Rakoff Memorial Lectureship on the topic of DSM-5 Perspectives on Iterative Revision in Psychiatric Diagnosis. Today's lecture is one of 4 named lectureships in our department honoring distinguished faculty. Dr. Vivian Rakoff had a renowned career serving as a former chair of our department, as well as psychiatrist-in-chief at Sunnybrook Hospital and the Clark Institute. He was also an inspiring educator who taught generations of students to incorporate humanism into the clinical care they provided. We are delighted to have Dr. Appelbaum join us today to give this distinguished lectureship in Dr. Rakoff's honor and share his reflections on the revision of psychiatric diagnosis. In support of continuously improving the quality of our citywide grand rounds, please complete the online evaluation that will be sent to you via a link from Eventbrite shortly after today's talk. Your feedback, as always, is very much appreciated, so we know what went well and how we can improve to better meet your needs. And before I close, please save the date for our next citywide psychiatry rounds offered as part of the department's Future of Psychotherapy conference on Friday, April 28th, where Dr. Paula Scher from Dartmouth University will be talking about psychosocial treatments for PTSD in honor of our department's Mary Seaman named lectureship. We hope to see you there next month. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to and introduce Dr. Benoit Mousson, the Labatt Family Chair of our Department of Psychiatry, to give a few remarks and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Shane, for your introduction. And I just want to echo a few things you mentioned. So today's lecture is in honor of the legacy of Dr. Vivian Rakoff, who was indeed a beloved educator, colleague, mentor, friend, and leader in the Department of Psychiatry. You mentioned some of his leadership role. He was a psychiatrist-in-chief at Sunnybrook Hospital. He was also director of postgraduate education of our department before becoming chair of the department, and at that time, psychiatrist-in-chief at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry. who was one of the founding partner institutions of what's now is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH. Many of us knew Dr. Rakoff as an inspirational educator with an intellectual approach to life. He taught generations of students to incorporate humanism in their approach to clinical care, and he was a highly sought mentor. He was also an orator whose talks were dazzling for both their breadth and synthesis. And I had the pleasure when I came to Toronto 18 years ago of hearing him talk at Ground Round about various topics. And it was always, the word dazzling is characterized his intervention. This, in honor of his impact on our department, the Vivian Rakoff Memorial Lecture was created to enable the sharing of knowledge and expertise, which we believe is a fitting tribute to somebody who was a tireless educator and a lifelong learner. As I mentioned, he was still attending Ground Round in his 80s and was an active participant. And for today, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer, Dr. Paul Appelbaum. And as you have heard, he's currently the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine and Law at Columbia University, where he's also the director of the Center for Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. We are talking briefly of his career. He's part of what I call the Pittsburgh diaspora. He was in Pittsburgh before me in the late 70s, early 80s. He moved to Boston for, I think, a year. And then he was at the University of Massachusetts for close to 20 years. And he was a chair of the department there before moving to Columbia, where he's now. And in addition to his role in Columbia, he has a national role in the US as chair of the DSM Steering Committee of the American Psychiatric Association. He has also authored many articles and books on law and ethics in clinical practice and research, and his recent work has focused on the ethical and psychosocial impact of advance in genetics. But I think today he has decided to focus his presentation on the DSM-5 and the way it's being changed. And I ask you to virtually applaud him as I'm passing the virtual mic to him. Dr. Appelbaum.
Well, thank you so much. Let me share my screen here. And let me just say as I begin that I remember Vivian Rakoff. I remember him quite well. He was a force of nature, it always seemed to me, a wonderful, powerful lecturer and teacher, and I'm honored to be able to give this lecture in his name. What I want to do with you today is to talk a little bit about the history of the ways in which the diagnostic and statistical manual that we all rely on has changed over the years, and especially to focus in on the current process of change, which is what we call an iterative revision process that I'll describe to you. And I want to think with you a little bit about what's good about it, what the problems are, and what challenges likely exist down the road for this way of revising the diagnostic formulations that we all use. So to start with a little bit of history, as many of you know, I'm sure, the very first DSM was published in 1952, and it was largely used for statistical purposes. That is, it gave hospitals a way of classifying the patients they admitted and developing annual reports and statistics that allowed an overview of the patient population they were serving. The descriptions of the disorders were very brief, tended to be in narrative form, 2 to 3 sentences, and not more than that. DSM-1 was revised 16 years later in 1968 with the publication of DSM-2, and this is the version of the manual that I trained with, because until the very end of my residency, this was the manual that was in force. It too, like DSM-1, which it tweaked in some respects, it focused more on environmental causes of or influences on psychiatric disorders, classified many of them as reactions to outside experiences or pressures. But again, it stuck with this 2 to 3 sentence narrative description, sort of a prototypical description of somebody with each of the disorders in the manual. The big change, of course, comes in 1980 when Robert Spitzer drives the development of DSM-3. DSM-3 looks much more like the manual that we know today. For the first time, rather than 2 to 3 sentences of prototypical description, we now have explicit diagnostic criteria for all of the conditions in the manual, which were designed to increase the reliability with which these diagnoses could be applied. There were a set of revisions, mostly not major, embodied in the DSM-3R in 1987, and then DSM-4, 1994. There was a text revision in 2000, and the current edition of the DSM diagnostic criteria, DSM-5, was published in 2013. And of course, just last year, we had the issuance of the DSM-5 TR with essentially unchanged diagnostic criteria, but an updating of the text to allow the incorporation of many of the new studies that have been done since the DSM-5 closed in 2012 to provide a more accurate and timely picture of the epidemiology, presentation, et cetera, of the diagnostic categories. So at least since DSM-3, there have been certain characteristics of the DSM process of revision. They've been multi-year efforts. Remember, DSM-5 was published in 2013, but the planning began in 1999, and the task force that oversaw the work was already appointed by 2006. They involve a lot of people. There were work groups that totaled 160 participants for DSM-5. They were broken down into 12 different diagnostic areas and charged with looking intensely at those areas and recommending needed changes to the DSM task force. There was, in addition, opportunity for extensive public comment and review, and ultimately approval by the APA board. The process was and has been over decades now criticized in a number of ways, and many of these criticisms are legitimate. It was time-consuming. It was costly. Bringing people together. This was pre-Zoom days for work group meetings, involved a lot of travel and a lot of time from a very large number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and others who were involved, other health professionals who were involved in the process. It also incentivized the proliferation of diagnostic categories, which in part accounts for the ever-increasing thickness of the DSM manual, by turning over to groups of specialists who, many of whom had spent their lives studying one particular type of depression or anxiety disorder or one manifestation of stress. The opportunity to embed their work in a new diagnostic category in the diagnostic manual. Decisions were negotiated and often based on expert opinion rather than necessarily having strong data to support them. And of course, the publication of the manual was directly tied to the financial interests of APA. Well, what's the alternative to this kind of process? In the wake of DSM-5, it was suggested that we could do things differently. That if we had a process of continuous improvement based on iterative revision, that would speed things up. We would not have such a delay in the incorporation of new knowledge as it became available. We could peg revisions to new data and discourage revisions when there were not new data to support it and insufficient evidence to justify it. And we could do all this because we now had the DSM online. And online formats, at least in principle, allow instantaneous dissemination of changes at, if not minimal, at least relatively low cost. And so, knowing all this, the Board of Trustees of APA in the spring of 2013, just as the DSM-5 was being published, established a work group on the future of the DSM. As a past APA president, I was asked to chair that group, and we were charged with developing a proposal for DSM as what back then was referred to as a living document. A year later, we came back to the board with our report, which they approved and which proposed a set of principles to guide revisions, which I'll show you in a moment, as well as a structure for how we would do it, which I will also discuss. So these were the principles we brought forward. The first was perhaps paradoxical in the context, but I think extremely important. In general, stability in psychiatric diagnosis is a good thing. It promotes consistency of our clinical practices, and it allows data that are gathered in research settings to be combined and used over substantial periods of time. When you change diagnoses, it's not only a burden for clinicians to learn the new criteria, but it also means that many of the research data that have been gathered on existing categories using then current criteria can no longer be combined with data that are gathered under the new criteria. However, we recognize that there are advances in the field that may now and then require revision of DSM diagnostic criteria and text to comport with the latest scientific knowledge. And since that knowledge will accumulate at an uneven pace for different disorders, changes should be made when warranted incrementally for those disorders for which change is indicated. And as I suggested earlier, online publishing makes all this possible. And so the structure for doing this involved, as we proposed to the board and as they approved, the creation of a steering committee for the DSM. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment, including people with expertise in psychiatric nosology, research, clinical psychiatry, and previous experience with the DSM. And under the steering committee, the creation of a small number of review committees that have responsibility for broad areas of psychiatric diagnosis and are encouraged to review proposals that may not be directly in their area of expertise, so as to discourage the unwarranted proliferation of diagnostic categories that seems to occur when we leave this in the hands of specialists. This is the current steering committee. My vice chairs are Ken Kendler, the distinguished psychiatric geneticist, and Ellen Liebenluft at NIMH, and you can see we've got an array of really terrific people. And I want to underscore the importance of our external liaisons as well, from the three relevant NIH institutes, all of whom have been very involved, with a special shout out to Wilson Compton from NIDA, who has been a terrific participant. We have in our initial report, and then subsequently, we have indicated the types of submissions that we are willing to entertain. So you could, and I'll tell you in a few minutes what I mean by you, propose a change to an existing criteria set, the incorporation of a new diagnostic category or a new specifier in the DSM, deletion of an existing category. You may spot an error in either the diagnostic category or the text and ask for that to be corrected or clarified. Your focus may be on an error in the text itself, and you may request a change there. We also have a chapter at the back of the DSM on conditions for further study, and you could propose an addition to that chapter. Moreover, we have a chapter which is part of section 2, the criteria section of the manual, for something called other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention, which are not diagnostic categories per se, but they represent other things going on in a patient's life that may be relevant to their diagnosis or treatment, about which treating clinicians should know. So they may be things like homelessness, or being subject to child abuse or spousal abuse, or unemployment, or the like. And I want to show you, there's not time to go through all those categories and show you all the criteria for each of them, but I want to show you as an exemplar here the criteria that exist for what in many respects is the change that attracts the greatest interest from the public, from the media, and from many members of our professions as well. That is the addition of a new diagnostic category to the DSM. So if you would like to propose the addition of a new diagnostic category, we would ask you in your proposal to provide substantial evidence that it would do each of the following. It meets DSM-5 criteria for a mental disorder. You can provide strong evidence of the validity of this disorder, and I'll show you in a moment more about what we mean by that. The diagnosis can be made with at least moderate reliability. There is substantial clinical utility to this diagnosis. For example, it would help us identify a group of patients who now are not receiving appropriate care because they are not properly identified, and we have an example of that to share as well. It doesn't overlap with existing diagnoses, and we ought not better to consider it as a subtype of existing diagnoses. And if we adopt this new category, it will have a positive benefit-harm ratio. That means, for example, that the false positive rate will be relatively low, and we won't run a risk of causing harm to people due to social or forensic considerations attached to the diagnosis. And if instead of an entirely new diagnosis, you want to add a new specifier or subtype to an existing diagnosis, we ask, again, for strong evidence of validity, reliability, and distinctness that is non-overlap with existing categories. So that's an example. And if you were interested in doing this, you would go to our web portal, DSM-5.org, which you can also reach through the APA website, psychiatry.org. We would ask in a structured format that you tell us why you're proposing the change, what its magnitude is, to provide evidence regarding the validators, reliability, clinical utility, and either deleterious effects of the current system or potential deleterious consequences of the change, so that we can take that into account as well. This is what the proposal submission portal looks like. You click on the button and it takes you in a structured way through the submission of the required data. So I mentioned that one of the criteria we ask for when we're looking at many categories of changes, but I showed you the example of addition of a new diagnostic category, was that it is a valid category. And you might reasonably ask, well, what do you mean by that? How do I know what constitutes a valid diagnostic category? And so we have provided some guidance with a set of 11 validators that we ask people to look to and to provide evidence regarding, recognizing that almost never will there actually be data on all 11 of these, but the more data there are on more categories, the stronger your proposal will be. And the categories of validators fall into three broad classes, what we call antecedent validators. Does this disorder that you're proposing aggregate in families? Are there consistent sociodemographic and cultural factors that exist prior to its onset? Similarly, are there environmental risk factors that can be identified? Or does a prior psychiatric history of some sort predict, as it were, the onset of this condition? We also are interested in concurrent validators. That is, are there cognitive, emotional, temperamental, personality, or other correlates of this condition unrelated to the proposed diagnostic criteria, so it's not tautologic, that are consistently present? Are there biological markers, for example, molecular genetic markers or neural substrates, fMRI evidence, et cetera? Are there consistent patterns of comorbidity? And can we point to some consistency in the degree or nature of the functional impairment associated with the disorder? And finally, the third category are predictive validators. If we make this diagnosis, what does it tell us about the future? Is there likely to be diagnostic stability over time? Does it tell us something about what the course of illness is likely to be? For many of our diagnostic categories, of course, the mere making of a diagnosis, schizophrenia being a great example, doesn't necessarily tell us what the long-term course will be. And does it tell us something important about response to treatment? That is, if we identify this diagnostic category, do we know better how to treat the patient who's sitting in front of us? And you'll note that some of these categories are in italics, and we consider those to be high priority validators. Let me go back and just highlight those. Familial aggregation is probably the best evidence of antecedent validation. Biological markers, when they exist, and functional impairment are the high priority concurrent validators. And all three of these are high priority predictive validators. We give somewhat greater weight to those high priority validators. We ask that in general, the data that you're presenting in support of a proposal should come from more than one research group. There are proposed conditions that are out there in the literature that have only ever been investigated by a single group in a single place. And although that doesn't necessarily indicate that they're not valid conditions, given the biases that are inherent in research and can affect the outcome of research, it's much more persuasive to have more than one group weigh in on the validity and reliability and utility of a proposed category. And we also ask that the strength of the data should be proportional to the magnitude of the proposed change. So if you're suggesting a minor tweak in diagnostic criteria and you have some data to support that, that may be fine. If you're proposing an entirely new diagnostic category, we're going to ask for much stronger data to recognize that as a valid addition to the DSM. Initially, your proposal comes to the steering committee, and we review it at a meeting and ask whether there's sufficient evidence on its face to satisfy the criteria. And if so, we refer it to one of the 5 review committees. I'll show you those review committees momentarily to take a deep dive into it, confirm whether or not the proposal is on firm foundations, make suggestions for revisions to either the criteria or the text that would accompany it. It then comes back to the steering committee for review, and if we agree it should move forward, we then post it for public comment. And when things are posted for public comment, they're publicized in psychiatric news, and we typically contact the professional organizations or advocacy organizations that are most directly associated with the proposed disorder or actual disorder, if it's a change to an existing disorder, so they can notify their members that they've got either 30 days for a minor change or 45 days for a more substantial change to submit comments. And I can tell you for some of the changes that have been posted for public comment, we have gotten hundreds of comments. People are very interested, understandably, in this process. The comments typically go to the review committee, which decides whether or not any further changes are needed, and then back for final review by our steering committee. And the ultimate question we ask is, does substantial evidence exist to demonstrate that the proposal has met the criteria for approval and addition to the DSM? If we think it has, it then goes to the APA approval process. First to the APA Assembly, which needs to approve all substantive changes to diagnostic criteria, and then ultimately to the APA Board of Trustees, which has the final say. This is not a fast process, but it also doesn't take the 19 years that it took between DSM-4 and DSM-5. But it's not a matter of weeks or months. The process from start to finish can typically take a year or a little more. We have an expedited process, however, for corrections and clarifications. So if somebody spots an error, we can correct that much more quickly. Errors in the text don't have to be approved by the board. Errors in the diagnostic criteria do need to go through the approval process, but typically that has been much more rapid. So I said that there were 5 standing review committees, and we use standing committees with the addition of consultants for specific proposals when needed to have some consistency in the criteria that are applied and the approach to review over time. And as I said earlier, the committees are dominated by generalists and not area specialists who only have a narrow focus on their particular area of expertise. You can quibble, and justifiably so, with the way we've divided the world, but here's how we've done it. There's a neurodevelopmental disorders review committee, and they tend to get most of the proposals related to childhood disorders as well. That's where our child psychiatrists are heavily concentrated. There's a, for want of a better term, serious mental illness review committee, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, neurodegenerative disorders, and internalizing disorders committee for depressive, anxious, trauma-related, etc. Symptomatology. An externalizing disorders review committee, which also covers personality disorders. And finally, a body systems disorders review committee, which does things like sleep, feeding disorder, eating disorders, sexual related conditions. So a year or two ago, we looked at the first 3 years of submissions that we received. And over that period of time, when we started this, we had no idea whether we were going to get flooded with more proposals than we could possibly handle, or whether we'd be sitting there waiting for the phone to ring and nothing would ever come in. And the answer turned out to be neither. Over 3 years, we received 29 submissions. So, roughly 10 submissions a year, more or less one a month. And the results of those submissions were the addition of several new diagnostic categories, the most significant of which I think was prolonged grief disorder. And in the Q&A, if you want, we can talk a little bit more about that. We modified the criteria for one of our diagnoses, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, ARFID, and of the texts for 2 diagnoses where people pointed out what they thought were important misstatements that could affect the diagnosis of the condition. And we added codes for 2 new categories to other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention, that chapter at the end of the DSM, for suicidal behavior and for non-suicidal self-injury. We also oversaw the development of the DSM-5 text revision, which was published last year, a 2-year intensive 2-year effort. There were some modifications to the criteria sets when there was some sort of error or inclarity, but most of the changes are in the text, and they included updating terminology related to gender disorders, also related to ethno-racial categorizations and the complex language used to describe different groups and their unique risk factors for illness, including such things as the experience of racism and discrimination. So I want, in the last couple of minutes of my presentation before we open it up for your comments, to talk about some conceptual issues that we've run into along the way and some challenges that we think are looming ahead, and then we'll open it up for your comments and thoughts. So where does all this fit into the thousands of years of development of psychiatric diagnosis? You may not think of it that way, but really, we go back to the Greeks, at least to the Greeks, in terms of categorizing mental disorders. Clearly, our focus is on refining current diagnostic schemas in an evolutionary way. We're not trying to rethink the entire structure of psychiatric diagnosis. And Chang, who's a philosopher of science, has called this process epistemic iteration. But it's not clear over the long run whether that's the only way to do things. There may come a point when advances in the biology of mental disorders are sufficient to warrant a thorough rethinking of the diagnostic framework. And for that, we would need a different process, which may look more like the process for DSM-3, 4, or 5 than the iterative approach that we're undertaking currently. And as much as we would welcome, and I think the field has been searching for biomarkers of mental disorders that could be useful for diagnostic purposes, to date, there is only one DSM category that has a biomarker as part of its diagnostic criteria set, and that's narcolepsy. So we're not quite there yet, although we would be very interested to hear proposals for the incorporation of additional biomarkers if there are data to support that. Many of you may know about RDoC, the research domain criteria, which have been formulated by the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, and which, when initially promulgated, were put forward as an alternative way of thinking about psychiatric diagnosis. I think they're not. I think they represent a set of hypotheses about the most effective ways of conducting psychiatric research at a variety of levels, which RDoC specifies, from the molecular through the cellular, through the circuit level, the systems level, the organ level, up to the level of the whole person and the environment around that person. Whether that materially changes psychiatric research, whether it accelerates it, which I think was the original hope, whether it has any implications for psychiatric diagnosis in the long run, we'll have to wait and see. But the person who now oversees the RDoC effort, Sarah Morris, at NIMH, is a liaison to our committee, and we are in constant contact, and she's able to have input to any changes that we propose to make as well. And then there's a question which is, I think, particularly provocative, which is, to what extent can we, as much as we want to, rely only on the available evidence to decide whether a change should be made? And I can tell you now from experience, this is the end of my 9th year of chairing the steering committee, that even when there are substantial data that speak to the validity of a new diagnosis, studies often use different criteria. So data on reliability are lacking, and it may not be possible to determine which specific criteria best describe the condition at hand, at least not possible to determine that based on the data alone. And I think we have found that the application of professional judgment here of researchers and clinicians is unavoidable because the data are rarely univocal, they're rarely unequivocal, and judgment is unavoidable in this context. So briefly, challenges ahead. We need to walk a fine line here between changing things too fast, which, as I suggested earlier, can be destabilizing to the field, and being too resistant to change. If nothing ever changes, there's no point to having this whole process. It's just wasting the time and energy of a lot of people. And so we need to calibrate our review and its level of rigor to the optimal level of change. It's also not clear in the long run whether a process like this that relies on the field to generate proposals is enough in terms of keeping a manual like the DSM up to date. In contrast to previous efforts, this essentially outsources the work of coming up with proposals and gathering the relevant data to support them to psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals around the world. Whether that will get us where we need to go, I think remains to be seen. The appeal of it is obvious, but I think that the success is still a question that needs to be answered. Clearly, this works well when there's a committed group of researchers who can get together and collaborate on a proposal. We can talk more in the Q&A about prolonged grief disorder as an example of this. But when that group doesn't exist and a proposal comes in from one or two people who may or may not be representative of all the people who work on a condition, the process becomes more challenging. And finally, there are a lot of people who are interested in adding diagnoses to the DSM. We rarely get proposals to remove diagnostic categories, although we have had one of those currently in abeyance. And whether we can rely on the field for those kinds of proposals is unclear as well. So let me stop there. Let me unshare my screen. And I'd be delighted to take your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Appelbaum, for this excellent presentation and for sharing your perspectives on the iterative revision of psychiatric diagnosis, reviewing some of the history around the revision of the DSM, the current process, and reflecting on the challenges of this process. I will now open up our Q&A, and I invite questions from our audience for Dr. Appelbaum into the webinar chat box. And I see we already have a number of questions and a number of thank yous, Dr. Appelbaum, for your presentation. So we do have a question from Anthony Young. The original DSM-5 field trials for the diagnosis of major depressive disorder shows very low inter-rater reliability. Based on this low inter-rater reliability, MDD might not even satisfy one of the key requirements to become a DSM-5 diagnosis. Is the steering committee looking into the reliability of the MDD diagnostic criteria or receiving submissions from clinicians about this?
Yeah, so let me respond in a couple of ways. It's absolutely true that the reliability was very low in the field trials and probably would be considered problematic if this were a new proposal. It's also true, and here I speak for myself, that I don't think the field trials were carried out very well. People were not well trained in the application of the new criteria for any disorder before they were sent out to apply these and collect data on the reliability of applications. So, I think there's a big caution in looking at any of those data, whether they turned out well or poorly for a particular diagnostic category. We have not received a proposal to alter the major depressive disorder diagnostic criteria. That would be a big change. If the field is ready to do that, we'd be happy to look at what was proposed. I will say that part of our process involves taking DSM-5 as a given. So DSM-5 is the starting point for this iterative revision process. We're not going back to systematically relitigate, if you will, all of the controversies that attended the decisions that were made for DSM-5. Taking that as the foundation, let's move forward. You want to suggest changes to existing criteria? Great, give us the data that will support those changes, and we will consider them. And if they're strong enough to warrant incorporation, we'll recommend that the changes be made.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a question from one of our resident learners, Jeffrey LeBlanc. You spoke about focusing on minimal incremental change when revising the DSM. You also spoke about the subjectivity of early DSM editions with a focus on expert opinion more than available data. This would suggest the mechanisms for DSM revision inadvertently perpetuate things like social biases. What steps is the APA doing to balance consistency and stability of DSM criteria for research, clinical, and educational purposes with the potential harm caused by pathologizing of normal variations in human experience or potentially discriminatory language of diagnostic classes?
Yeah, so the DSM-5 TR, the text revision, had a work group that I was an ex officio member of, focused on the language and potential discriminatory implications of the wording of the DSM. And many changes were made to the text. And at times, data that had been elicited and cited in the previous edition, but were subject to misinterpretation in a potentially discriminatory fashion, were eliminated from the text revision. So these are issues that we're very sensitive to. In terms of subjectivity and all of the influences that could come into play, this is where the data-oriented focus of the process hopefully will be helpful, although remember my caveat towards the end of my talk, which is you can't remove judgment from the process. There will always be some data that aren't there, some data that are in conflict, some decisions that need to be made, and judgment, I have come to conclude, is an unavoidable component of the process.
Thank you very much. We do have a few questions along the similar theme. Could you also comment on personality disorders in the DSM? And then also, if you had the freedom of Robert Spitzer in the 1970s, would you have done things differently?
Whoa. Well, let me start with personality disorders. For those of you who haven't tracked this closely, the world of personality disorder research has largely concluded that the current categorical structure that we use for personality disorders is really quite inadequate in a number of ways. People tend to qualify for multiple personality disorder diagnoses or for none. And the structure of the categories doesn't map onto what the research base clearly suggests are a number of continua on perhaps 5 major dimensions of personality that would better characterize the people we see. So during the DSM-5 process, a proposal was made for moving from a categorical to a more dimensional model of diagnosis, with some categories, residual categories, included, and in the end was turned down by the APA Board of Trustees. And although they did that in executive session, for which I wasn't present, my sense is that a large part of the rejection was based on a concern about how much of a burden the new dimensional structure would place on clinicians, not just to learn it, but also to implement it. Nonetheless, the world of personality disorders research continues to believe that we are taking the wrong approach. So we currently have a process underway. We got a proposal for a dimensional approach, not unlike what DSM-5 considered and was ultimately rejected. And we have now started a process in which we've pulled together the major researchers in the world of personality disorders. And they have formed 4 work groups. We have asked them to systematically review and compile the literature related to comparisons between the categorical approach and a more dimensional approach, and to come together to bring that literature back to us and to formulate a proposal based on that literature that would be more scientifically sound and yet clinically usable and acceptable to the majority of clinicians. I can't prejudge how this is going to turn out. It would be a big change for the field, but that is the process that we have underway right now. Would I have done anything different than Robert Spitzer did in prior from 73 to 80, as he was overseeing the reconceptualization of psychiatric nosology embodied ultimately in the DSM-3. If you look back at that process, and there have been a number of histories written about it now, there was a lot of talk about data and somewhat less reliance on data than you might have been led to think by the description of the process. There was a lot of subjectivity and incorporation of categories simply because they were traditional, they'd always been there, and there was a reluctance to have too radical a change. I think we might have been better served back then when the field was ready for a revolutionary change to have bitten the bullet and taken some more steps to eliminate categories for which there was not sound empirical grounding. But there were all kinds of political considerations that he was subject to. So I offer that as a post hoc reflection, and perhaps I could have done no better than he did, and maybe worse than he did had I been involved at that point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Appelbaum. We do have a question from Anthony Levitt. Will the committee ever ask the scientific community to address specific issues?
So we haven't done that yet. I think it's a good question. It may be that becomes necessary because there's something out there that that seems badly in need of change, and nobody has come forward to do that. What we have done, there are some proposals that we've received for which we had concerns because they came from a single person who seemed to be pointing to a real problem, but that one person couldn't possibly represent the field as a whole. And in those cases, we have encouraged the formation of groups of researchers trying to be as inclusive as possible to be representative of what the world of research is saying about a particular proposed disorder, in order to get them to come up with a consensus that they could then bring to us. But so far, that's always been triggered by a proposal rather than a de novo effort on our part. But that may be needed in the future. It may just be the only way to spark something that needs to happen.
Well, I'm just noticing the time, so I'm going to close the Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Appelbaum, for your thoughtful presentation, sharing your reflections on the ITER revision of psychiatric diagnosis. We're deeply grateful for your commitment to our profession and leadership in this important work. And thank you as well to our amazing support team behind the scenes today, Anne Marie and Matt, for your help for today's rounds. And finally, thank you to our attendees for joining today's session and for your engagement and participation in the Q&A. We look forward to seeing you at our next citywide psychiatry grand rounds on Friday, April 28th on psychosocial treatments for PTSD. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.